Actually, I don't mind being called Smith because my brother was Smith. Back in the days when I was actually working for a living rather than living off the progress of my retirement fund, I used to tell my class, I'm going to tell the same thing I'll tell you first day class, is that I'm lazy and I expect you to do a lot of the work, which means I want questions, discussion, lead in when you want. At times I will ask you a question as a group and we won't move on until we get an answer. So if you go Quaker on me, I'm a very patient man and I can outlast you. So with that warning in mind, let's get started. I want to do a real quick exercise, and don't think this too much, otherwise it doesn't work. But if I were to ask you, and then just shout out a few answers, what are the synonyms that come readily to mind when I use the term self-interest?
Typically, a bad connotation.
Okay.
Selfish.
We tend to have negative connotations by and large, yeah, in the popular parlance, is that self-interest is oftentimes thought to be the same as selfishness. Well, we're going to see if that's the case, and how Adam Smith thinks about it. Now, the same thing with altruism. What are some synonyms that come to mind?
Giving.
Giving.
Selflessness.
Selflessness. So again, the popular connotation is that it's oriented toward the other and not toward the self. Now, what Smith is trying to think through is, are they as unrelated as we might assume? Or is there an intrinsic relationship between self-interest, properly understood, and altruism? Or to use older theological language, how do you love yourself and love your neighbor? And he wants to talk a lot about that actually in both books. Now, interestingly enough, he doesn't talk much about God. It used to be love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. Now, I don't think that's a liability with Smith, because quite frankly, there are some people who try to turn him into an honorary Christian or an honorary Calvinist even. And I don't think that's the case. He's a Stoic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Stoicism is incompatible with Christian moral thought. But I think it's probably not too smart to try to make it into somebody that is not. So what we'll be spending a lot of the evening talking about is really in exploring how is the regard of self properly ordered to the regard of the other. And are they mutually exclusive, or in fact is one dependent on the other? Now, Adam Smith may also appear to be an unlikely source to help us think through this problem in our modern age. I mean, after all, he's a stuffy, out-of-date old Scot who is out of touch with our world. Adam Smith's world is not the same as ours. And others would simply dismiss him as a proto-libertarian who's only out for himself. And still others would dismiss him as being a greedy capitalist, and therefore not really worth paying attention to. But he's none of those things, I think. He's really simultaneously an interesting, timeless, and timely philosopher who has much to offer us in thinking through the issues of our world. In other words, I think it's to read Adam Smith today is also to gain insight in the kind of world you and I are living in. It just takes some work to do that. Sometimes it's not obvious, and quite frankly, he writes in an antiquated style, which means it's hard work to read. It's not an easy author to read. Now, there's two important books that he wrote: The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. But why am I trying to take them on together? I mean, both of them are pretty heavy. Well, because they belong together. You can think of them as a ditto. Is that in coming to some understanding of how self-interest and altruistic regard should be regarded, that's what he's doing in these two books. Or to he's trying to think how self-love and neighbor love are related. And that is a deeply moral undertaking. That's why I think it should be regarded as a moral philosopher. This is just fundamental moral thinking. How is the self related to others? How is others related to the self? So to oversimplify, the theory of moral sentiments provides a theoretical structure of moral philosophy, whereas the Wealth of Nations is a practical application of that theoretical framework. In other words, the Wealth of Nations, which is written nearly 20 years later, is a kind of working out of the moral sentiments in a practical kind of way. In other words, Smith is not an economist, he's a philosopher. And he may have invented political economy, but I don't think he meant to. It's this way of him working out some of the other work that they're interested in. Now, a few preliminaries are in order, because he uses some key terms and concepts that we need to keep in mind. They're a little bit different than how normally we might use them. First is the whole notion of sentiment. So what exactly is a sentiment? It's somewhat like an emotional orientation, something which what Smith is trying to say is reason is important, but unlike most of the Enlightenment, reason alone can't get you where you need to go. That morality is ultimately grounded in something more than reason. It's grounded in these sentiments. And so you may also call them the affections. Again, our more modern terminology would be what we would call the total person. Emotions, other kinds of things. And he does strike some very similar things, although I don't know if he ever read him, but Jonathan Edwards. Because Edwards writes quite a bit on the affections and how that claims us in terms of our moral outlook and that sort of thing. And there's some, like I said, I can't see any evidence that Smith read Edwards, but there's some similar things that you can draw from. He uses the term sympathy, and we shouldn't read into that empathy. I would think Smith would have a great deal of problems with empathy, because he would not argue, I feel your pain. What he would say is, I can imagine what you might be going through. But quite frankly, the literal translation of sympathy is, I'm suffering with you. And that's important to keep in mind, because also I think Smith would say, if there is such a thing as empathy, and he has deep suspicions about it, he would say it's not necessarily a moral category in its own right. It's not necessarily good to be empathetic. But why would he say that? Because if you think about it, my hunch is that the best torturers and con artists in the world are deeply empathetic. They do crawl into the head of the victim and try to feel what they're feeling, so that they can do the task. So the empathy in and of itself needs a moral framework in order to really be of positive value. So what he's concerned about is sympathy. How do I imagine what the other is going through? And what are the limits of that imagination? And what should be some of the limits of that imagination? Do you really want to identify with everyone else's emotion? Everyone else's feeling, what they're going through? And then he talks about the virtue. He uses a classic Aristotelian notion of virtue. And that is, a virtue is the mean between two extremes. So, for example, to be courageous means you are not, on the one hand, rash, and on the other hand, you're not cowardly. The virtue of courage means drawing that balance between the two extremes and not falling into either one of them. Because on this battlefield, you don't want a soldier, for example, who's rash, going to run in too quickly, nor do you want a cowardly soldier who's going to run away. You want that courageous warrior to assess the situation. So again, what Smith is using when he talks about virtue is that mean between the two extremes. Now, he doesn't use the terms, but he also is not very fond of monopolistic protection. That's why he's against mercantilism. And why is he against that? Because he says ultimately it harms what we would call consumers. When you're in deal with monopolies, you're going to pay higher prices and maybe get inferior products. And what he's saying is that that's not the role of the state to protect certain business interests. It's the role of the state to protect consumers. And the best way to protect the consumer for Smith is open it up to competition, get rid of the protected industries. So he's not a big fan of the East India they have a monopoly on TV, another thought. He's also basically saying exchange, very important. This is how you and I interact most often. With people is through exchange, temporary, quick. And to keep in mind, the most basis that Smith has in mind of an exchange, what is yours becomes mine, and what is mine becomes yours. So it's a swap. And that's why for him, exchange is almost synonymous with trade. So it's very important for Smith to talk about trade, particularly among nations. This is how you really increase the wealth of nations, is through smart trade. And he's very close to Ricardo about the comparative advantage. It doesn't make much sense for Scotland, for example, to try to make wine. It doesn't have good climate. But Portugal does. But Portugal doesn't have a very good place for raising sheep. Scotland does. So Scotland trades its wool, which is very good at, and Portugal trades its wine, which is very adept at, and both benefit. So it's not that trade is a zero-sum game, it's a win-win game. Again, it's not his language, but it's how we would describe it now, and Smith saw that very, very clearly. And with the notion is that's how human beings flourish, because they learn to engage in exchange. Now that was quite frankly the biggest problem I had with teaching my students, when I was teaching my students, is they assume that almost any kind of exchange is zero-sum. So that the market is always oriented toward increasing the winners and making the losers worse. And it's just basically what Smith does is he fractures that and just says, no, that's not how it works. Trade benefits both parties. Now there may be an uneven thing, but both people engaged in the exchange ultimately benefit. We'll look at more at that when we look at the wealth of nations. I think that's where self-interest in the other regard really comes into play. And then finally, he talks about the specialization of labor. And again, I think that's a key concept for him, is that essentially if you want a society, if you want a nation to flourish, the best way to do that is you get someone else to do your work. There are a lot of things you need. Now that sounds bad, but bear with me. This is an exercise again I did with my classes often when we got to the section on economics of globalization. Was I would ask them, can you be self-sufficient? And they said, well, that's what capitalism is all about. It's all about autonomy. And I said, really? Okay, so do you and I live in a capitalist society? Yes. And we're all seeking autonomy, right? Right. I said, okay, so how many of you woke up this morning in a building that you built? And almost, maybe occasionally a hand would go up. How many of you ate food that you either cultivated or slaughtered? Hardly ever a hand would go up. A couple of hands would go up. I said, did you make your own seeds? No. How did you get to school? Well, took public transportation up the girl. I said, did you build a bus? Did you build a road? Did you build the tires? And all of a sudden they begin to realize that in a market-based economy, you're very dependent on one another. That it's not simply a search for autonomy. It's a search for who are you in relationship with to engage in the exchange. So again, that's I think an important concept that Smith begins to realize is how we relate to one another is through primarily this specialization of labor. I do things that you need, provide things that you need, and through exchange. And then finally, Smith is often dismissed as saying is that all he ever talks about is the invisible hand. And that's just simply not true. There's only twice that he mentions the invisible hand. Once is in the theory of moral sentiments, where he writes, they are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all inhabitants, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advances the interests of society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. What he's really saying about is that by nature we were designed in certain kinds of ways where we require each other's assistance. And again, I can't find any evidence of necessary reading, but this is very similar to Althusius, where Althusius is saying by nature you and I were created certain kinds of way where none of us can get anything done on our own, and that's why we need each other. And that's why we have society, when we need to learn to work with one another. And that creates, for enthusiasts, ultimately a peaceful society. I think Smith is saying something very similar to that, is that this invisible hand, and it's an analogy, is that we're so designed that we actually benefit one another by not being self-sufficient. And that's why we're drawn to one another. And then he mentions that once in the wealth of nations in respect to merchants seeking their own self-interest, for each merchant intends his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which has no part of his intention. In other words, we oftentimes benefit others by not intending to benefit them. We pursue our self-interest, and pursuing our self-interest provides something for someone else who's pursuing his or her their self-interest, and that's how we benefit them. And that we have no idea that we're benefiting, but in fact, we are. We'll see that later with the infamous butcher, baker, and brewer, not seeking their interests. All right, before we delve in, and beginning with theory of moral sentiments, and I probably want to divide the two texts about halfway in our time tonight. Any questions before we get going on some of the summary? You ready to enter into the mind discussion?
Oh, yeah. Just a suggestion, if you could put the microphone a little bit closer to your,
Okay.
for us all folks.
I'll try to remember.
Thank you.
If not, make a gesture toward me. Okay. Again, the theory of moral sentiments begins with a discussion on sympathy, because it's the key concept in Smith's thinking in that book. And he begins by writing, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." Now, he uses the example of pity as a universal kind of sentiment, where we see it in other human beings, and we're naturally trying to relieve that sentiment, whatever is distressing them, and that's what pity drives us. Now, you can also put a positive thing in it, is that there are some people in our lives where we simply take joy when they are happy, and we don't see any obvious benefit to ourselves in doing that. We simply intrinsically are drawn toward people who are happy because we want and wish their welfare. And that's what Smith recognizes, is that even though self-interest is a prime motivation, it's not the only motivation. And that's, again, something that Smith fights against, is reducing anything to one principle. He wants to say, look, life's pretty complex, okay? And we're motivated by a lot of different sentiments. And it's really the proper ordering of those sentiments which is the challenge, and not reducing it to one single sentiment. So he goes on, "We cannot know what others feel, but we can imagine or try to understand their plight. Consequently, for example, again, pity stimulates a sympathetic imagination. When someone is in distress, we can imagine their distress, and we like pity, try to understand them and be with them, and drawn to that sympathetic suffering." And he says, look, there's many bodily clues that invites our emotions and invites our responses. For example, a smiling face is to everybody that sees it a cheerful object, as a sorrowful countenance, on the other hand, is melancholy. It shouldn't surprise us that when someone smiles, we usually smile in return. And Smith's saying is, again, it's something ingrained in human nature that we are drawn towards similar kinds of responses. So it's really a notion of moral psychology, and that we're drawn to one another through these bodily clues and signs. And he says, some passions, however, do not elicit sympathy, namely those based on fury or rage that may harm others. We tend not to gravitate toward those people who are very angry. In fact, many times we try to keep our distance. We find it repelled, in fact, by that. Again, if someone yells at you, you tend to want to get out of that situation. And again, what Smith is observing is saying that shouldn't surprise us. That we are drawn towards certain positive sentiments and repulsed by what we would classify as negative. Now, he says, if the very appearance of grief and joy inspire in us some degrees of the like emotions, it is because they suggest to us the general idea of some good or bad fortune that has befallen on the person. And again, it appears that that nature uses the passions to draw us to people with whom we share a common interest. And again, what Smith is simply saying is that should not surprise us. We are drawn towards certain people more strongly than we are to other people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if we didn't have a kind of hierarchy of emotional response, we wouldn't really flourish as people. So, for example, it would be horrible to be a member of a family in which everyone is treated with casual indifference, as if the other person doesn't matter. But that's not necessary, but you don't necessarily want to try to be intimate with every stranger you meet on the street. So it's an ordering of an appropriate emotional response to these different kinds of people that we encounter in life that Smith's very interested in. Is how do we order our responses to strangers as opposed to ones that we love? And what's the difference in that? And what's the moral difference in how that happens? What happens when you begin to confuse that? So he will admit from the beginning, sympathy is always imperfect. The judgments you and I make will never be perfect. They are imperfect, we will have to revise them. We have to learn from our mistakes and how we might read different kinds of emotional reactions. In other words, one thing I discovered when my daughter was a teenager is never think you can read the emotion correctly. It just, as much as you try, you're going to make mistakes in reading the other person. Now, therefore, passions and thereby sympathy, something like sympathy, is triggered by context that is bound to promote differing responses among individuals. In other words, what we face throughout life is we go from context to context. Within those contexts, we encounter different kinds of people, and those people will trigger different kinds of reactions. So, for example, the example Smith uses is that a person insulted may not react to the insult, whereas you and I, as the observer, may blush for shame. And you can't predict in advance how people will react, or other people might react very differently to an insult. So again, what Smith is trying to recognize is the complexity of both the context and the response to the context. And therefore, we can only judge each other in respect to the common faculties and sentiments that we share with one another. If someone is genuinely completely different from you, you can't make any judgments about them because you have no idea what they're up to. We probably would not understand the proverbial Martian if they were in our midst, because we would have no understanding of what a Martian is. So what he's saying is that there's certain universal things that have to be assumed in order for humans to interact. Certain kinds of things will always bring joy, certain kinds of things will always bring distress. Now, would he say that there's differences among cultures? Yes, but it doesn't destroy the notion that there are certain universals that have to be taken into account when we're dealing with the responses to the sentiments. And we tend to judge the sentiments of others in accordance with whether we agree or disagree with them. If I find something agreeable, I'm probably going to approve it. Or if I find something disagreeable, I'm probably not going to approve it. And again, that shouldn't shock us. We tend to judge by what we think is right and wrong, good or bad. But over time, another person may cause us to amend, change, or adopt new sentiments. I don't know if you've ever had the experience that you get off to a very bad start with someone, and you think, I will never be able to be friendly to this person, or to regard this person much. What Smith would say, a positive sentiment. And then over time, you learn more about them. And you have to begin to amend your judgment. Saying, maybe I was too quick to condemn. I wasn't aware of everything that was going on, or whatever. Smith is saying, again, that's what human beings do. They amend their judgments over time as they gain more knowledge. And that, again, is just as a sidebar. That's a huge problem in any form of ethics or moral philosophy, is you have to make judgments and you never have a full understanding or full knowledge of what is at stake. And yet you still cannot avoid the notion of judgment. You still make some kind of assessment that this is right, this is wrong, this is what you must do. Again, to get my students to kind of think about that, we would play a game in class from time to time called, What Do You Think You Saw? And you would describe the situation, and then they would have to assess what they thought they saw. And then when you said, well, maybe that wasn't right, you got it wrong, you have to now amend the judgment. And that's what Smith is saying, is yes, you do. As you gain more information over time, as you gain more knowledge over time, you need to amend those judgments. And therefore, all of us have a moral duty, according to Smith, to strive to perceive and sympathetically understand the sentiments of others before we judge. We first of all have to make that effort, is to try to figure out, what is the other person thinking? What is the other person doing before I can make any kind of full judgment of that person? So it calls for the first step of sympathy is coming to an understanding of the other as best we can. Now, we expect less sympathy from an acquaintance than we do a friend. And this is, again, going back to the hierarchy. If a friend isn't very sympathetic with our plight, we're usually kind of irritated or whatever it is. The friend has let us down, but they should be sympathetic with it. Where we don't necessarily expect that from someone like the dean. I'm exposing my cards with most of the deans I've worked with. But anyway, it's a notion that basically the more familiar someone is with us, the more sympathy we should be able to expect from them. So the more intimate the relationship, presumably the more sympathy that we can expect. And also likewise give. That we would be remiss if we did not give sympathy to those that we knew well, but not necessarily sympathy to someone we barely know or even a stranger. So for example, if you're trying to provide sympathy to someone you've never met before, it's very difficult to provide and very challenging. Again, what I experience in this is when you really are dealing with strangers and there are certain expectations of the role, this gets to be a kind of moral confusion because you're really not sure what's going on. So, quick example again, back when I was a university chaplain, I get a phone call on Saturday morning. Dean of students is out of town, but the associate dean saying, I've got to go down and tell a young woman something. So I go down, and finally, after searching around, find her early in the morning. I have never met her before in my life. And I have to take her aside and say, you need to go home. Your sister's in the hospital, and your mother shot and killed your father. Now, again, not having any clues, any kind of relationship, how do you begin to show and exhibit sympathy to that person? At best, what you can provide is a kind of practical support, but it's really not what Smith would say is sympathy. And he says that shouldn't be startling to us, that if you don't have a relationship, then the sympathetic response is simply impossible. Okay, and therefore, though, we do have certain guidelines in society that provides emotional stability for individuals. It's not as if we have to reinvent the wheel every time we encounter one another. There are certain rules of decorum and behavior which give certain kinds of clues of how we interact with one another to express this notion of something like sympathy. So before moving on, any questions, comments that you want to begin on? Now, he does spend some time talking about the unsocial passions. And the unsocial passions are those which tend to divide people. They tend to be things where they almost invite us not to take the other person seriously because they're offensive for a whole variety of reasons. And the unsocial passions would be things like extreme anger. Extreme anger tends to divide people rather than bringing them together. And what Smith is saying is there's a whole set of unsocial passions that we need to be aware of. But then he also says there are the social passions. And these are the things that bind people together. And he spends much more time talking about these passions. And he identifies them as generosity, kindness, compassion, friendship, esteem, and benevolence. And expressing sympathy with these passions is the same as expressing concern for the person who is the object of such passions. In other words, the passions can't be divided from the person who is the object of one's observation. It's not just simply that you're engaged in a theoretical enterprise. You're engaged in looking at the passions of a real person. And that's what Smith is trying to ground that. That this is not simply an intellectual enterprise, it's an engagement with other people. Now, then he has a third category of the selfish passions. And this is what I think is most interesting, is that the selfish passions lie in between the social and unsocial passions. It's a way of mediating. That if we were left to simply the social or unsocial, we really wouldn't have a very good society. But really what you need are these what's called selfish passions, so that in a sense, your well-being is linked to the well-being of others. And that's a way of mediating then the responses to the social and unsocial passions. And again, what you begin to see in this then is building up to the wealth of nations of how is self-interest and other regard related. And it is, what he initially says is selfishness can be trained to be something that's less selfish, but it can then act as an intermediary, a way of linking those together. And therefore, we oftentimes judge the motivations of others by how we see ourselves in that interaction, in that relationship. And that again is, I think, an important concept to keep in mind in the theory of moral sentiments, is that selfishness doesn't necessarily, when he uses the term, mean something pejorative. It's just simply saying, to use different language, should it surprise us that we're self-oriented? And Smith's answer is no. In fact, he would say something to the effect, you should be worried that someone wasn't self-oriented. Why are we self-oriented? Because we want what is good for ourselves. And if we know what is good for ourselves, then we also want what is good for others. So it's a way of beginning to look at the other by beginning with the self. And as long as you're beginning to realize that the other self is not entirely like you, there is enough of a commonality that you can begin to say, well, if that's good for me, it might be good for others. And so that selfishness is needed to balance the unsocial and social passion. It's a very complex kind of moral ordering, but a very important one for Smith. And I think that's what he tries to work out in the Wealth of Nations. How does that get worked out practically in something like exchange and trade and political relationships? Now, he then returns to the unsocial passions. He's trying to describe why are these destructive. And the two most basic unsocial passions are resentment and hatred. But why would that be? Any guesses? Why is resentment and hatred so bad? Sorry? Yeah, the blind and yeah, that's right. What else?
Hard to go back to that.
Yeah, again. How do you really get over resentment is the problem. Because no matter what is simply, again, it's not his word, but he can make the argument. The problem with hatred is that it leads to vengeance. You wish to take revenge. And how do you break the circle of revenge if all you want to do is justify yourself by bringing down the other? So that's why he says those are the two things that are the foundation against social passions. Is that if you're driven by hatred, if you're driven by resentment, you're not going to have a very good society. Because people literally will not trust one another. Because what they really see in the other is someone who has hurt them. You can never trust someone that you believe will hurt you. Do we see within our contemporary society resentment and hatred? Yeah, I think you do. In fact, judging by what we see on the news each night, we would think that's all we have is resentment and hatred. Yeah.
Just a quick question, we talk about hatred. Hatred sometimes, maybe you could say there's a lack of reason or reasonability. And if I'm not mistaken, to Adam Smith, the loss of reason was one of the greatest human crime.
Yeah, I think that's right. You do lose your reason because you become trapped in the hatred, and that's all you see. Yes, there is a loss of reason there. Now,
And when you look at chaplains have become insane, it's like, don't hold it, because there's no logic, there's no reason, it's just pure hatred, passion. This is like what we're losing.
yes. Now, what Smith, I don't think, does address is there a place for hating the act but not the actor? In other words, the old term used to be, you hate the sin, but you don't hate the sinner. And I don't think Smith really addresses that, or at least not substantially, as I recall. So there is that question about, is there a place, should we hate evil? And if you answer yes, even there you have to be careful though, because after a while, rather than hating the evil, you begin to hate the evildoer to an extent that you strip them of their humanity, strip them of any kind of moral regard. And that's the danger of it, I think. So yeah, that's a good question. But clearly, if you're driven deeply by hatred, you do become irrational, because all you want is that vengeance. You want to destroy the other. Yeah, and as a Stoic, I mean, I don't want to dismiss Smith as saying, okay, reason is not important to him. Reason is very important to him. All he's simply saying, though, is not enough, is that reason is attached to these things called the affections, to the sentiments, and you can't divorce them as well. You and I simply do not do everything according to reason. And that's merely his observation. And actually what he wants to say, I think, is the second step, and it's probably good that we don't do everything according to reason. I mean, to be blunt, if we did everything according to reason, I can't imagine why anyone would be a parent.
But hatred rejects reason.
Yes, hatred does reject reason. Yeah. And that's why it's dangerous. I think you could also say resentment rejects reason. Because again, why should I resent someone who's successful? And yet that becomes a very useful political tool oftentimes. But it's irrational.
So are we doomed to never be a consistent, smooth society if we're all interested in self-interest and you resent people who are different from us?
Yeah, I mean, okay. It's a very interesting question about, as late moderns, what do we regard as a good society? Do we see a good society as something where the state for example, plays a predominant role? Or do we see a good society as something where the state plays a minimal role? And that's a topic of debate. Because some might argue saying the only thing that really keeps our passions under control is the coercive power of the state. So we need the state to keep us from killing each other. I mean, that's an argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that could be an argument. On the other hand, some could say, no, it's the worst possible society because that means people are no longer responsible for their own actions. And they can't show enough self-discipline, enough self-action, where they learn to negotiate and learn peaceably with their neighbors without the threat, of course, of power that the state has. So that could be one thing that Smith wants to talk about. The other thing that Smith would raise would be, the more you are oriented on practical tasks, the more you learn how to work with other people who are different than yourself. It's when you get up into abstractions that we begin to fall into the traps of hatred and resentment. And I think an example of that is, there's a columnist I like to read by the name of Salon. She spends a lot of times on the back roads of America, just driving around. And she makes a very interesting observation. It says when you get into these small towns, it's not like what you see on TV. People learn how to live together, they learn how to get things done, put their differences aside. So if the park needs cleaning up, the Kiwanis and the Rotary Club get together and clean it up. And so it's when you get into the higher levels of abstractions and things like that, where you begin to characterize the other as something who's a worthy object of your resentment and your hatred. I think she may exaggerate, but I think she's on to something. Because the more I travel, the less I encounter what I see on TV. And when you actually encounter other people. And I think that's what Smith is maybe, I don't think he's a great fan of a very strong central state. I think what he wants to say is the state is the last resort. And what he wants to encourage people is to take responsibility for their own lives and to learn how to negotiate with one another and get things done. And he sees that through economic exchange. That's why he writes so much on the wealth of nations. And it's in the wealth of individuals that eventually produces the wealth of nations. Other questions, comments?
Well, it's a comment I would have.
Yes.
This is a struggle. How can we peaceably coexist, maybe live a lot of levels of both parties? Instead of this, we live in a very fractious society where there's absolutism. I'm totally right, I'm totally wrong. Government's being controlled by screens and 95% of the people live in the middle. So, and this is just all a lesson of like how the world is going on and have a value-based system. Figure out all coexist.
Yeah, and I was talking to Chris the other night, and we were talking about something similar to that. If you'd asked me 3 years ago when I first retired, is there much hope for achieving what you just said, I would say no. There's hardly any signs of hope. Because, again, I was spending way too much time in the bubble of the academy. It sees the world very differently. But since then, I've been associating with other people, and there are signs of hope out there. I see it in some of the homeschooling, some of the private academies, young people asking questions that I never thought I'd live to hear. Of parents who are structuring how they're raising children differently, how they're relating with neighbors. And I think true change comes from the bottom up and not the top down. And I'm beginning to see signs at the bottom, and maybe it's going to percolate out. That's what I find hopeful about that.
So if you're at the university, what are you concerned about the indoctrination that's going on? Because once it's inculcated, it's there for a long time.
Hannah Arendt, almost 50 years ago, wrote an essay on the desert of the academy. least some oases, friendships that keep sustaining us. I think it's worse now when I retired, because those oases were not only shrinking, they were under attack. But yeah, I think, I mean, when I left the university, I regarded it as an intellectual wasteland. It was not really a place of ideas, it wasn't a place of indoctrination. It was not a place of inquiry, it was a place of ideology. And it was clear to me that, you know, there were some very talented young professors that came in, and the only thing they learned very quickly was not to say anything. And, you know, to me, if you're gonna, what's the fun of the academy, you can't have a good argument. And it was no longer a place of arguments, good or bad, it was just a place where it's pretty clear what the expectation was, what you were expected to do. I'm able to characterize that, but run into a lot of people who think the same thing. And the question is, what do you do? Can you reform colleges and universities? Do you need to reinvent them? And I don't know what the answer is to that. But my hunch is that it has something to do with a recovery of the true liberal art, so that we learn what it means to live a good life, to be a good person. And even in so-called liberal arts colleges, those are rare and far between.
It just made a suggestion, and I don't want to get off right now, but something that relates to the discussion just the last 5 minutes. Václav Havel wrote an essay, and I forget the name, but basically it was in the midst of the Czech occupation by the Soviet Union. And what he talked about was ignore them and run a parallel society. Society where people matter and the state doesn't matter. When you talk about retiring and leaving where the practice, focus, whatever you want to call it, the people at the street level aren't that way. They're just not. It doesn't matter their color, it doesn't matter their sex, their race, it doesn't matter. They're just people. And that really is an enlightening essay if you want to take the time to read that. And it is about just ignoring norms. You're a human being, it cannot affect you unless you let it affect you. And it's great reading.
I think that's right, because what tyrants hate more than anything else is to not be taken seriously.
Being ignored.
Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, someone else to read alongside that was some of Roger Scruton's work early on in his career, because he kept sneaking books into Eastern Europe and teaching courses and things like that. And he has some interesting reflections on that. And in typical Scruton fashion, this is well written and delightfully caustic. So.
After having been out of the educational bubble now for 2 or 3 years, if you were able to go back in and see another class of students, what is there anything different that you would teach about Adam Smith to those students?
It's a really good question. The best way to answer it is I wish I had exhibited more courage, because I probably could have gotten away with it because I was in an endowed chair. And the name after my name was the chairman of the board. And I wish I had used that as a platform. Not to necessarily draw attention myself, but to call attention saying, what are we doing? Now, what sustained me was I had some PhD students who were better than I deserved, and they got it. And they would hear certain kinds of things in common. And they wrote some good dissertations, and they got away with it, and things like that. Now they're in positions where I think they're exhibiting more courage than I exhibit. Just refreshing. There was other clues that you would pick up in lectures where, as in a seminary, you would think this would be Minnesota, I would quote C.S. Lewis. And much to my surprise, 6 or 7 students would come up and say, oh, I love C.S. Lewis. But officially, C.S. Lewis in my seminary was dismissed as a lightweight you shouldn't pay attention to. And, and my response was, no, he's just a good writer. And so, yeah, I wish I had done that earlier in my career, which I'm encouraged to. The other thing, too, is that, you have these new study centers that are being developed across the street from the universities. And they attract a lot of students to come in, and they take extracurricular lectures. They don't get any credit for it. But they're looking at the classics, they're looking at the liberal arts. They also have 2 or 3 meals together a week. It's really, I think, an enactment of what C.S. Lewis would call academic friendship. And they come in and do that. I think, there again, going back to Smith a little bit, he had a lot to say about friendship, how important that is. Because, true friendship, true friends are going to hold you accountable. They're not going to let you get off easy. And that's what Smith, I think, knew was important in human life, is you need friends to keep you on track, keep you moving great. And that's what I think is lacking in the modern academy, is distinct lack of friendship. I only have to, when people ask me, what's the best part about being retired? And I said, being dean and committee free.
Do you see this as possibly being cyclical? This whole movement that started in the 60s has gotten up. And these people like Milton Friedman and Tom Sewell, they're contrary to that. You see it possibly, hopefully, going the other way.
Yeah.
Becoming more academic free.
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, it may be that maybe one of the silver linings of the bad response to COVID will be the closure of certain institutions that shouldn't be open to begin with. And it's sort of a creative destruction could be going on within higher education, where basically you have to build back up from the ashes. Now, someone asked me one time, where did the university go bad? And I said, when it tried to do something useful. Because it kind of justified its own existence by things that it really couldn't deliver on now, and that is good paying jobs, which there's a lot of jobs you don't need a college degree for, which are perfectly good jobs. What colleges do well, I think, is to indoctrinate people into a culture and into a way of thinking. But you don't need 98% of high school students in a pre-college track to do. So I think if colleges and universities can return to their original mission, which is really to teach a tradition and a heritage, and not necessarily to offer job skills, they could recover that. And that's now, I think you can learn your skills other ways, and every way this appropriately. But it doesn't necessarily. Do you need a 4-year degree, for example, to do IT? I don't know. Maybe you just need a certificate. But I think that's where the colleges got in trouble. And now they can't deliver on what they had promised. And also the other issues, the debt. Talk about a case study in unintended consequences. Guaranteeing student debt, I think, is a classic case study in that. Because it's an entitlement. Pardon?
Both sides do it.
When you pay them off.
Yeah. Other questions? Smith, or anything else? All right, why don't we make a shift and really start looking at the wealth of nations as a way of beginning to do the practical application of this. Well, let me back up for one moment and just ask a question that I think comes out of the theory of moral sentiments. Given our discussion, is it natural to hold others in high regard, low regard, or indifference? How does such a belief influence our notions of trust and suspicion, our social policy, and our politics? how should we assume our stance with others? Indifferent? Okay, what?
I think we're prone to judge.
Okay.
We were prone to, but how should we?
Yeah, okay, just, by indifference, do you mean, say a little bit more what you mean by indifference.
Either way, go either way, without a disposition.
Okay. So,
Maybe it's not the right definition of indifference.
yeah, I don't know, I mean, I think you're right, that in certain circumstances, indifference is probably called for.
And so you really, well, you build that relationship to enact it for them.
Yeah. The question that comes to me is then when do you when does indifference give way to trust? And when does it give way to
Well, the
suspicion?
question was immediately judging people.
Yeah.
Once you bypass the immediate.
Okay.
How about slightly higher regard?
Pardon?
Slightly higher regard. It forms a basis for a possible, positive outcome rather than zero sum.
Right. And there again, isn't it interesting how and where we exhibit trust and mistrust of people? Because I mean, I think economies are based entirely upon trust. If we don't trust exchanges, I mean, think how often you buy something at the till, and you trust the person's going to, well, we don't use cash anymore. But basically, you trust the person at the till not to take your credit card number. Generally, and generally, you know, that trust is not violated. So it begins to raise the question about, okay, how can you have a society without a fundamental kind of floor of trust? And yet, if you're too trusting, you can get into a lot of trouble. Because I mean, isn't that what contracts are for? I mean, contracts are essentially formed because of mistrust. It's a way of, you know, ensuring that the trust is not violated. So it's it's a very interesting concept of where we do place the trust, where we don't, where we place people in positions of indifference, where we're forced into certain kinds of. I mean, I trust the pilots on commercial airlines, or I wouldn't get on the plane. Now, I think going back to your question, do I treat them with indifference after they've landed? So yeah.
But in business transactions, that's why lawyers make a lot of money, because of mistrust.
But a lot of business, I mean, fortunately, when I walked into a store, I don't have to sign a contract. And I think, you know, the question that you asked them, and maybe you have to ask them is, okay, how much do you predicate something like economic exchange upon trust or mistrust? How much do you predicate your political policy on trust or mistrust? And what are the consequences of whether you make the assumption? And are you willing, like Smith says, maybe you have to go back and amend those assumptions? And I think that's what's difficult in any kind of political policy, is politicians do not tend to want to go back and amend what they've done. They just don't want to admit the mistake.
I'm still concerned about how we survive as a country. You're talking about individuals, and that's certainly important, but we have to elevate that. We have situations with Mr. Jinping wanting total control, and Mr. Park wanting to kill everyone. How do we make this whole thing work? I just don't understand.
Yeah, and, okay, what Smith is going to argue is, again, that a nation is built from the bottom up and not the top down. And what he was saying is that if you're having problems as a nation surviving, it's because you're not paying enough attention to the daily affairs of people. extraordinary about Smith is how much time he spends on the ordinary. And what he's saying is if you get the ordinary right, it percolates up. So maybe the question is saying, how do you build a strong nation? Maybe you have to pay more attention to how the daily interactions of people and how are they ordered or disordered. And maybe that's where the reform begins. Now, you can argue something saying, well, that's all well and good, but it's not going to help us over the next 10 years in struggles with China, Iran, and other kinds of countries. Now, Smith may not be able to offer a lot of advice because he wasn't dealing with nation states. It's a different kind of thing. And what's really a sobering argument, if you want to read, is Philip Bobbitt. Because he argues we're in another transition now from nation state to market state. And in the market state, you don't want much political loyalty because it gets in your way. So all a country can do is it can't protect you, it can only offer opportunity. And that's, now, do I think he's right? I don't know. But what's also sobering about Bobbitt's argument is if he's right, it's also pretty grim because he identifies 6 transitions prior to this, beginning with basically the absolute monarchical state. He says, the new political regime is never resolved until a major war is fought. So that, for example, what he calls the state nation only comes to an end with World War I. And then you have the creation of the nation state, which is still being fought out. What exactly that will look like. And what his theory is, the nation state's not going to last long. Because there's just too many. And he makes the point. He says, look, my interest as a consumer usually trumps my interest as a citizen. And again, that's a pretty sober argument. And again, I'm not saying he's right, but I think it helps to read as much material as possible so that you see all the counter arguments out there. And I think right now we're not quite sure if there is such a thing as the common good. And if there is a common good, what is it? And how do we support it? And how do you combine both common purpose and diversity? Now, Fukuyama makes again a very interesting argument that says if you want a democracy, you can't have diversity because you have to have people of common purpose working together in order to maintain a society. It says if you want diversity, you want an empire. Because historically, only empires have been diverse. Because you have someone saying, don't kill those people and leave them. So and again, that's a very sobering argument, but that's, I think, what we're going through right now is can you simultaneously have something like a republic or a democracy that is comprised of diverse people? Can you build a country that's based on an idea and not a tradition? That I think is the American experiment. It's based on an idea, on a document, and not necessarily a long tradition. Other questions?
But we have a constitution, which is based upon its whole history,
Mhm.
starting with Smith,
Mhm.
and Salon,
Mhm.
everything. That's actually, there's a sense now that we've done a very good job of learning to keep that constitution intact. Now that people are trying to pull that apart.
There is, and again, that's been the experiment, is that how long can that document keep us together? And what I think opponents are saying is only a document. And I think what supporters say that that document is terribly important because it is our tradition. And that's, I think jury's out on that, in that way.
Oh, what you're talking about is to be educated as a citizen. To be actually, citizen, how to be educated as a human being.
Right.
Not just a citizen. Just interacting with other citizens. But this is just kind of a template, a baseline of what we need to do in order to peaceably coexist and federally.
Right. See, I think you could read Smith and not know what kind of government you lived under. I mean, I just don't think he found that terribly important. questions, comments? Okay, we're gonna kind of go through the Wealth of Nations gazelle like. Okay, here's the statement that always irritates a lot of people. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. And people say, see, he's just selfish. Well, the thing to remember that is several things. Is that number one, brewers, bakers, and I always say candlestick makers, but that's not right. Butcher, brewers, and bakers. Yeah, they all need farmers. And they need customers. Or they're not gonna make a go of it. And what I constantly point out to my students is saying, okay, no, it's clearly, they're out for a buck. They wanna make money. There's no reason to go to your local butcher and expect that, the first question is, how can I help Mr. Waters today? Not gonna happen. He's selling a product. But here's the thing is, yes, they've made money, but you're no longer hungry and thirsty. So you've benefited from that exchange as well. And chances are you would still be hungry and thirsty if you didn't have butchers, brewers, and the like. Now, someone might say, but boy, they charge a lot of money. You know, it just takes me too long to work to really afford to eat well or drink well. And Smith would say yes, because they're all monopolies. What you need is more competition. The more competition you have out there, the less you will pay for those necessities. So what Smith is saying is that we're better off when we promote competition. And that isn't, I mean, and again with Smith, the other side of competition isn't as necessarily cutthroat. It's also cooperative. I mean, there's a level of cooperation and competition or it doesn't work. I mean, again, every merchant needs customers, and all customers need merchants. That's a cooperative relationship, but it's also engaged in competition. Those merchants are competing for the business. And likewise, those consumers are competing for jobs that are feeding, and it makes them better employees. So what Smith is saying is something to the effect is that nobody goes out there with the intent necessarily of helping their neighbor, but they end up doing it by pursuing their own self-interest. Because those other neighbors are also pursuing their self-interest. That's where they come together. And I think it's one of the more counterintuitive notions of what Smith is getting at is, in theological language, you could say how providential. And Smith, I don't think would necessarily disagree with that. What he's saying is that basically we're ordered in such a way that the competition helps us form a better society because it provides lower costs, it provides better products. Again, I would tell my students, you know, life was not great when there was only one telephone company. 3 colors and 2 designs, and it didn't work very well. And yet, when they loosened that up into the competition, you now have this thing called a smartphone. So I think Smith saw that very clearly, that if you want to promote the good of society, you have to promote the good of competition among both merchants and consumers, producers. I think the other takeaway from the Wealth of Nations that again is the notion of trade, how important trade is. That people say, look, if you, 2 things, if you don't trade, you're going to either A, end up with products that you're not going to have the product you want, or B, you will have them at an exorbitant price because you're trying to produce them in an environment where they can't be produced cheaply. Where trade is going to provide the products you want at a cheaper price because it's providing competition. And so it's merely an extension of what we talked about between merchants and consumers. So I think, you know, Smith's early on is a proponent of free trade. You know, you end up up protecting and you actually end up harming. So I think that's like another debate, political debate that you constantly have, is do you want protectionism or do you want free trade? And which ultimately benefits. I mean, now, I think the argument against free trade is, well, it creates unemployment. Well, yeah, perhaps in the short term, but what does it do in the long term? In terms of, I mean, it's the same thing with the AI debate right now. But if unemployment doesn't remain fixed, it changes over time. At the beginning of the 20th century, about 50% of the population was involved in agriculture in some way. At the end of the 20th century, less than 2%. Now, it doesn't mean we had 48% unemployment for the 20th century. Other kinds of employment were created, and a lot of things that people didn't foresee. But does it cause disruption? Yeah, I think Schumpeter's right, it is creative destruction. And there's no reason trying to gloss that over, that if you're going to be committed to free trade, there's going to be disruption. On the other hand, if you go into protectionism, you're going to pay higher prices, and you may not have as much of the products available to you as you might like. And that, to me, is a political debate. What kind of policy do you want? You're probably going to get different answers.
Well, just as Schumpeter also said, that's the cost of innovation. Not only don't just 2%, we used to be a country that economies. We're now a service oriented,
Right.
not products. And that's just all part of the evolution of constructing and replacement.
That's right. And, you know, you have to ask, would we be better off if we produced our own products? I mean, that's really the debate.
To jump in on that, great example, but there's a company out of Alabama that we pointed earlier about if you want to produce it, redland cotton, they grow the cotton, they mill it, and they make sheets. But who wants to pay $400 per set of USA made cotton bed sheets, right?
Are they comfortable?
I don't have any, but, you know, waiting for the sale, you know, but, you know, it's that, but now we can get cheap sheets, right, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you can go down the line.
Yeah, anyway.
I mean, to show you, first time I came back to Indianapolis was 2016. And I knew I'd been away for a while, because I asked, this is I think even before Lyft or Uber, it's a taxi driver. I said, where's the RCA? Stadium? And he kind of looked at me and said, how long has it been since you were here last? But then I remembered, you know, RCA was a big name. And it's gone. And, you know, the different car manufacturers came to the list. Now, I think part of it is also we have a nostalgic, you know, sense of it. Maybe those products weren't as good as we remember them. I don't know. But again, what Smith is simply saying is, if you want to benefit the consumer, you open up trade. Because somebody's going to supply it cheaper. And, you know, Smith had a vested interest that he did consume other copious amounts of wine.
Do you think there are like constraints on that, like there's a limit?
You know, how much?
Yeah, like what's the limit of the cheapness of the, at what expense of the, you know, unsocial passions?
Not too. I mean, there are certain, I guess I could only speak anecdotally. I don't pay attention to study.
Me neither.
Okay. I mean, there are certain things that I just want to get as cheap as possible. And I don't care about the quality because I know that in a couple of years it's going to be worn out. And I'll be down. So, other things, I keep telling myself to get what you pay for. So, you know, I'm willing to pay the extra money for the quality. You know, where that ends up being manufactured, I don't know. Sometimes it's Europe, sometimes it's Asia,
Or
sometimes
care.
it's here. Yeah, care really. Yeah, I want the quality. where I think it's, where you have to draw a line, is there certain kinds of essentials that you don't want to be held ransom by others? So is it certain pharmaceuticals, for example, certain metals, certain kinds of other products, for munitions, but you don't really want to be at the mercy of trading partners who can close that pipeline, or an enemy who can close that pipeline off. So that might be something to take into consideration.
There's a recent book by Robert Lighthouser that goes into that pretty substantially. Pretty interesting.
Does he use Smith at all in that book?
I'm sorry.
Does he use Smith at all in that book?
No, not what I recall.
Well, I know we're coming to the hour when I'm supposed to stop, so I will simply pose to you simply two questions to consider to end our discussion. I don't care what order you're taking, whether you want to mix it up. Is a lot of ink has been spilled concerning selfishness and altruism, greed and generosity and the like, often as contending and incompatible attitudes. Can Smith help us think about how they might be related? And the other question is, do motives matter?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, a lot of ink has been spilled concerning selfishness and altruism, greed and generosity and the like, often as contending and incompatible attitudes. In other words, you can be one, but you can't be the other. Can Smith help us think about how these might actually be related? And then the other question, do motives matter?
Motives matter?
There's so many,
Pardon?
there's so many motives.
Yeah, there are a lot of motives, and it, I mean, in some sense, what I'm getting at is, does it make any difference for me as a consumer, what the producer thinks, what they're trying to do? Does it matter if they're out to make a profit? Does it matter that, they're not invested in the community? There's a lot of motivations, and do the motives matter? Now, the reason I ask that is that where I spend a lot of my time with medical ethics, motives can and do matter. And what I mean by that is, there's the notion of the principle of double effect, where a physician knows that prescribing increased dosages of morphine will hasten death. But the intent is not to cause death, but to relieve suffering, for which death is a foreseeable and unfortunate consequence. Now, that means then that the doctor has not violated the oath that has been taken, because they're not intending the death of the patient. Does that matter in how I might regard the physician? It could. Because in jurisdictions now which are allowing euthanasia, the intent is clearly to kill in the life of the patient. And does that then change how you might view your physician? So it's, in those kinds of relationships, motives do matter. What I'm saying is, in most of the relationships that Smith talked about, do they matter? I don't know.
Well, you made a point earlier about the difference between empathy and sympathy, and you said that empathy could be used to hoodwink
Yeah.
someone. You empathize with them to figure out how you can pull the wool over their eyes and get what you want from them. So I think in that's a case where even within Smith's framework, I think the motive would surely matter.
I think it would. Now, what Smith had not encountered, and what you and I encounter on a daily basis, is advertising. I mean, it just wasn't prevalent for Smith, so he's not talking about that. And I think it's, and I'm not against advertising. Merchants have got to push their products and things like that. But what has intrigued me is how much advertising has changed. if you look carefully at most advertising, it doesn't really sell you a product, it sells you an experience. And there's a very interesting article, it's called The Desire of Desire. So it's really what advertising is saying is, you know, my understanding is that BMW used to promote their product because of superior engineering. Now they promote it as saying, you know, it gives you a certain kind of status, a certain kind of experience, and, you know, they don't talk about the engineering much. So so with Smith, it may be okay, and maybe as a consumer, I need to be suspicious of it. You know, maybe the onus is now on me to do my due diligence to, you know, to really ask, what are these people trying to sell me, and do I need it? Or do I really want it? So I don't know, I mean, maybe that's part of the moral test, is how do you teach smart consumers?
From an environmental standpoint, motives may change the means of production. And it's important, it's not merely based on profit and trade, but rather other values, other goals.
Yeah, and I mean, talk about interesting policies, you know, about this. Flying over here, I was sitting next to a woman who works for Siemens, and part of her thing is energy. And she says the German headquarters is absolutely baffled how the United States can be committed to pushing EVs and shutting down nuclear plants and trying to replace them with facilities that can't produce enough electricity for what they want to do, and there's no infrastructure in place for the EVs. And now, I don't think Germany is a good example either. They shut down all their nuclear reactors and came back to coal burning. But
They were worse.
yeah, they were worse. They were worse. So yeah, I mean, the environment itself is, you know, how do you protect the environment? Is really an interesting question, and how much moral obligation do we have to protect the environment? You know, and there, you know, do you follow certain environmentalists, or do you look at something like the Copenhagen Consensus? It's a very interesting enterprise. The other question to ask, from a philosophical standpoint, it'd be interesting to trace back is, when did nature become the environment? And is environmentalism now a kind of secular religion? It could be. And then also other kinds of impacts. You know, I'm not convinced ethanol is a great idea. You know, it raises food prices, and it doesn't burn as well as oil. They don't get quite the oomph out of it. Evidently BMW is not happy with it, it destroys their engine. Other last thoughts on Smith?
How does cancer culture fit into this?
The what?
Cancer
Oh,
culture.
cancel.
Where the extremists, with social media decides that one company is bad because of whatever social thing that they did or didn't do, and how they boycott it.
It's hard for me to get my head around the cancel culture, quite frankly, because I think we pay it way too much credit. And I think the reason that, for me, it's hard to get my head around is I just don't use social media.
I understand that, but they can close businesses down.
Yeah, they can.
Ruin people's lives.
I think people just need to push back on it and just say, take your best shot, I'm gonna go on with what I need to do.
It's just anti-Adam Smith.
It is anti-Adam Smith. I think it's totalitarian.
Artificial.
Yeah, it's tyrannical. It's a way of silencing opposition. I mean, I've never read Harry Potter, but I admire Rowling now. She speaks her mind. You know, good for her. Did you have a question?
Quick,
Yeah.
theoretical stupid question. Would Adam Smith be held in a different light in present times had he written The Wealth of Nations first, and the theory of moral summary second? One seeming about self-commerce explaining the other, would he be held in a different way?
I don't know, yeah, I mean, you gotta remember, for a long time, dirty moral sentences fell off the radar screen. Nobody paid any attention to it, and then it's kind of rediscovered. And there,
Those are all the nations, there's a better figure out.
yeah, and if you ask most people, they'll tell you that the Wealth of Nations was written first, but it wasn't, it was written 20 years after. I think Wealth of Nations came out in 1776, which I think is,
Right.
yeah.
Founding fathers read more.
And they did, and I think early on, that was the book he thought he was gonna be remembered for, but it didn't work out that way. And, so I don't know how to answer that question, really. I mean, it's a good question.
May I suggest
Mhm.
that the first one was idealistic and moralistic, and the other was practical. When he became more mature, he said, no, here's how things really are, not how things really should be.
Now, the criticism of the Wealth of Nations, there's a lot of weeds you can get lost in. And what I mean by that is the lengthy chapters on the corn laws. It's not the most stimulating reading. But he also has a very, I mean, for me, it was a very interesting question, because he basically asked, two things that are kind of interesting, as highlights, is, he asked the question, why are nonconformist ministers so much better than the priests of the Church of England? And he says, because the priests of the Church of England are dependent upon endowments, they don't care. Whereas the nonconformist ministers have to go out and raise their own money, and it makes them better. So he uses that as an example. The other thing is, he basically says, essentially, if you're going to go out and buy a lottery ticket, just buy one. Because you're going to lose, and all you're doing is buying a week of fantasy. Because you have to speculate on how you can spend this money that you're never gonna win. So, no, that's what I find interesting about Smith, is two things, is just, I think he was a shrewd observer of human nature. And I do appreciate his, painstaking observation